very warm welcome, everyone, for this online launch of the book John Clifford and Radical Non-Conformity. My name's Tim Middleton. I'm a tutor in theology at Regent's Park College in Oxford, and also the director of the Centre for Baptist Studies, which is very pleased to be hosting this launch today. The Centre for Baptist Studies was founded in 2002 and conducts research on the past, present, and future of Baptist life and thought. And I'll drop a little bit more information about the centre into the chat. Just to let you know that today's presentations are going to be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, but the Q&A at the end of our time today won't be recorded. So only the speakers should appear in that final version, unless you accidentally leave yourself unmuted. I'm absolutely delighted that our principal here at Regent's, Sir Malcolm Evans, has kindly agreed to chair today's session. So I'm going to hand over to Malcolm now to tell you a little bit more about what's going to happen in the next hour. Thank you, Malcolm.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and it's a great pleasure to be able to be chairing this online book launch this afternoon. I won't spend the time that we have at our disposal by saying too much about the book itself, because I know that the first of our speakers will be doing that in just a few minutes. So I don't want to steal their thunder, and I will introduce them in a moment. But it is, I think, a delight to be able to say that at this online meeting, we are also joined by some members of the family of Michael Watts, whose work we are here to commemorate the publication of today. It was only published a few months ago, and so I think this is one of the first occasions in which it's been able to perhaps have a discursive airing in the manner that we are planning to do so today. And it is entirely fitting that should be the case, because the work itself refers to John Clifford, who was an incredibly important figure in the evolution of Baptist life and history. So it is a great pleasure to be able to chair this today. Without any more ado, let me just move straight on to just saying a little bit about the people who are contributing, first of all, to this session. The way it's going to run is as follows. Joel Gregory is going to introduce the work. Now, Joel holds a BA and PhD from Baylor University, as well as an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and an MTH from Oxford. He's just stepped down from Baylor Truett's Theological Seminary in May as an emeritus professor of homiletics. And he's also the founder of Proclaimers Place seminars for adults in continuing education regarding preaching, which takes place in many countries around the world. And it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome again Joel to this online event. He is a great friend of the College of Regent's Park, and it's great to have him with us here speaking today. Once Joel has introduced the work, we are going to have two responses. The first is from Ruth Gouldbourne. Ruth is currently minister at Grove Lane Baptist Church in Cheadle-Hulme near Manchester, and previously she has served in churches in Bedford and in London, as well as teaching for 12 years at the Bristol Baptist College. We also then will have a contribution from David Thompson, who graduated in history from Queen's College and elected to a research fellowship at Fitzwilliam College before moving on to teach within the faculty in Cambridge for a very long time indeed, until his retirement, but was appointed to a personal chair at the university in 2007. He's a minister of the United Reformed Church, an emeritus canon of Ely Cathedral, with a long publication record in the history of non-conformity, church and state, and much else besides. So you can see we're very privileged in the people that we have contributing to the session this afternoon. As time is short, I will not carry on myself, but hand over the floor in a few moments to Joel. One of the downsides of an online meeting is that one, as a chair, cannot really exercise the normal prompts and privileges and prerogatives of a chair in person by, if people stray over time, perhaps leaning towards them or handing them little pieces of paper. And so I know that my role as chair is deprived of some of the both the pleasures, joys and traumas of the normal inline meeting. However, we all have a clock at the bottom of our screens, and I'm sure that we will all want to make sure that everyone has the full opportunity to present, but also, as Tim said at the beginning, to be able to profit from a question and answer session towards the end. The aim and aspiration is that presentations should all have been finished by about 5:45 to leave 15 minutes or so for a Q&A period, which I will do my best to curate. But with no more from me, let me pass straight over to Joel.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Malcolm. It's an honor to be part of this and give a bit about the discovery of what became this publication by Baylor University's Press. In 2021, I was on a research leave from Baylor's Truett Theological Seminary at work on a book yet to be published about Baptist battles, dealing with the downgrade, the North American battle in the 1920s and the Southern Baptist inerrancy controversy in the 80s. And I made the discovery of Dr. Watt's work in the Weston virtually inadvertently, and was fascinated with it. But I discovered in the frontispiece of it very pointedly stated embargo, that it was not to be copied by any means. I think in the spirit of confession, I started to take a picture of one page, and I was summarily told I couldn't do that. I learned my lesson that it really meant I wasn't actually sure if it was still enforced or enforceable, but it was. And out of that, and I must acknowledge my collaborator from the very beginning of this, Dr. David Bebbington, and I corresponded concerning the meaning of this embargo. And David, who is here with us now, had the background of that embargo. My discovery was in 2021. The embargo was placed there by Dr. Watts, who had subsequently intended to publish the work and with good reason had embargoed it. Evidently, the thread of all that had been forgotten over the decades. And Dr. Bebbington was able to make contact with Dr. Watts' widow, subsequently married, and she very much eagerly and kindly gave her permission to lift the embargo. When that happened, I not only made notes, but with my iPhone proceeded to take a picture of every page of the volume, which was certainly, I was later informed by younger people, that was a very low-tech way to do it. But I had all the pages of a carbon copy, which some of us remember, that had been hand-corrected in some of its pages from the original document. With Dr. Bebbington's considerable ethos, we went to the publisher at Baylor Press, who agreed to publish the book, which has resulted. That is really what I would like to say just about the background of the discovery. I must express my gratitude and debt of honor to David Bebbington, who did a great deal of work on this, to Baylor Press, and to a group of students, graduate students at Ruth, that actually, word by word, re-entered my iPhone pictures of the carbon copy, and the press edited that. And I certainly won't, Sir Malcolm, press to get right to the discussion of the book, but that's a little bit of its etiology and discovery.
Well, thank you very much for your background to the to the work, its rediscovery and the process which brought it into being. And now let's turn to those who are going to say a little bit more, commenting on the work itself. And so I think the floor first passes to you, Ruth. So I pass the floor to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to do this and to read this volume. The cliched advice is that one should never meet one's heroes. And I've had the chance to meet two while I've been reading this book, and neither have disappointed. Since I started to understand anything about Baptist history in England, John Clifford has been a hero. I had the delight as the student minister of leading and indeed closing the John Clifford Society, which was at that time the student group in London based at Bloomsbury. It closed not because of lack of reverence for Clifford, but because students found other denominational homes and denominational societies anyway had fallen from favour. But it was significant that as a society it was named after this great hero of the faith. And it was where I first came across him as anything more than just a passing name. And I learned about him. And then I had the opportunity to teach about him in the process of becoming familiar with English Baptist history. A towering figure that brought us into contact with a way of being Baptist that was at once familiar and alien. A world in which the words of a Baptist preacher were accorded attention in the national press, and that this was accepted by his congregation and honoured by the Union. A world in which non-conformity could make or break election fortunes. Very unfamiliar. And a world in which education is a matter of significant debate. A world in which resistance to government policy might be recognised as a matter of theological conviction. A world in which Baptists have disputes about issues to do with what is the gospel and how it is to be preached, disputes that lead to breaks in relationship and threats to the unity of the Union. That is familiar. But although I became fascinated by John Clifford and found his convictions, even when I disagreed with them, inspiring because of their wholeheartedness and his determination to align his theological and his political heart, heartwarming, yet I struggled to find a resource to draw on and to commend to others. There are significant pieces in the general histories, there are useful articles, but there was very little recent writing that helped me in my generation understand him in his. And that brings me to the other hero with whom I've been spending time, Michael Watts. As a good historian of non-conformity, I am indebted to his 3 volumes, The Dissenters. Indeed, it's one of my delights now that, thanks to a second-hand shop and inheriting a library, I now possess all 3 volumes. Such riches. But to have the opportunity to read his work on John Clifford has been a delight. But it's not just to read an account of a life, but also an insight into an era. To have explained both the wider issues in the downgrade, not just as an intra-Baptist dispute, but reflective of wider discussions, something we all know, but here presented in ways that have the insight of the critical observer rather than the partisan need to recruit to one or other side, particularly in the light of contemporary debates. That has been really helpful. Of course, there has been new research into that perennial discussion since this was written, but the presentation here, I think, is of importance because it offers insights that remind us what happened in those years was not just a Baptist issue, but it also helps us clarify what some of the particular Baptist aspects of it are, and both of those are important. We're accustomed now to treat many of our intra-denominational disputes as if they're simply our versions of a wider dispute. But the discussion here shows the way in which the discussions in other contexts have their impact, indeed can shape the intra-denominational dispute. And in particular, the question of who is it appropriate to share a platform with. And the detailed analysis of how the controversy unfolded, and in particular, the way in which the speeches at assembly and the ways in which those were changed as the behind-the-scenes deals that were made, those are all a vivid reminder of what it means to try and find consensus over issues that are central to faith. And also of the times when we met to have these discussions. And the comment on James Spurgeon's election as vice president, even though he was never actually able to serve, is a reminder that having helped save the Union from schism, he stayed active within it and involved at its deepest level. And that's a challenge and a promise to us today as we struggle to live together. And this in itself is worth noting. I also found it very enlightening to have the education debate laid out in such detail. It offers a new grasp of its complexities. To see the ways in which Clifford's political presence, indeed his party political presence, was accommodated, accepted, even honoured, is challenging. I feel a new mantra coming on, faced with our political landscape. What would Clifford do? What I missed was much discussion about the formation and impact of BWA. That Clifford was the first president is an important aspect of how that body understood itself and the identity that it was seeking to affirm. But apart from the recognition of the effectiveness in helping Baptists in Hungary find a way to live together, significant result, and one that's simply reported and not really discussed, there's little recognition of just what an important and difficult achievement bringing Baptists together across different cultures and different histories, what was achieved in forming the Baptist World Alliance. Similarly, the beginning of the European Baptist Federation, though noted as a place where Clifford offered an inaugural address, is not covered in any detail. A biography of one man, of course, is not the place for a detailed history of any institution. But the significance and the place of these institutions in Baptist life and Clifford's place in shaping them as part of his life, I would have appreciated knowing more about. He played a significant role in avoiding a split in the BU over the downgrade, and that's covered in great detail. He was also significant in shaping and therefore defining BWA and EBF. Now, of course, the warning about meeting heroes is because they turn out to have feet of clay. And it's true that Clifford, as we meet him in this biography, is no perfect man. There is discussion of the weaknesses in his theology, its lack of depth, and in particular, towards the end of his life, the way in which he had no resources, really, to meet the challenges of a world at war and the loss of the optimism that had driven his theology and practice. As it became clear that the convictions about inevitable progress, about the possibility of universal brotherhood, about the inherent good sense of people in making the world a better place, that all of those were misplaced, what shows it was also the case that Clifford had little to offer in their place. The commitment to individual evangelism was not something new, but with the increase in Clifford's attention to it, that did demonstrate the need for something to take the place of the optimistic theology of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, with its expectation that good sanitation and proper labour laws would bring people into the kingdom. And again, to read this now is to be reminded we need those among us who are theological thinkers and can communicate that. We have a strong tradition of Baptists of seeing the need and meeting it, but we also have a tradition of fighting shy of theology at times, and at times that can leave us seriously weakened. Similarly, to read in the 2020s something written in the 1960s is to find gaps in the analysis and in the emphasis that are inevitable. Although Watt's right about the decline in the churches and in church-going, his analysis of this is without the insights and tools that have become available since, and so read as rather limited and unsatisfying. But he wrote when he wrote, and we can't complain that he didn't rewrite this in the light of his own later research, but I know David's going to speak more about that. There were places in reading this where I wanted to say, now hold on, we need to say a bit more about this, or I want you to take on board this insight or analysis, only to realise it postdates this writing. Indeed, there were times when I wanted to say we need to say a bit less about this. At times, I find, because I often do, that the detail offered was such that the overall story was in danger of getting overwhelmed. But I recognise that's a particular weakness of mine in study. And I know that there are many who will find in that, precisely in that detail, the gift of the book. It's in the telling details that Michael Watts excels, the meticulous scholarship that means that in speaking of the downgrade and its aftermath, he does remind us that James Spurgeon remained within the Union. And that's an important part of the story that's often missed or ignored. Have I been disappointed to meet my heroes? Well, I would like to have thought that Clifford's theology had been robust enough to meet the challenges of the Great War, and indeed that he'd have been a good enough controversialist to avoid the incoherencies he eventually fell into in resisting the Education Act. I would love to have read Michael Watt's more thorough take on the role and impact of passive resistance in the context of some of the peace movements and tax resistance, or indeed his views on the development of passive resistance as a political tool in the climate debate. But these are dreams, the first wishing one of my heroes was less human and more storybook, and the other asking ridiculously ahistorical questions. I have absolutely not been disappointed in meeting them in this book. I've met Michael Watts, a writer whose scholarship, attention to detail, and presence to his subject is exemplary and inspiring. I read a lot of theses, and I wish more of them were like this. From his writing, I've been encouraged to explore in more detail bits of the life of Clifford that I know have been matters of recent research, and to which he alludes: Clifford's attitude to empire, to women's suffrage, to matters of biblical scholarship. As any thesis should, this is a book that, as part of its energy, offers new directions of questioning and discovery. And in the book, I have met so much more fully somebody who has inspired me for years, and now I feel even more inspired. Somebody who worked and lived the real world meaning of his faith, who put his energy and his purse to the expression of those convictions, and whose concern for the kingdom of God shaped an approach that was to change the lives of many. And that he was not perfect, that he failed, that sometimes he asked the wrong question or was content with a partial answer is evidence of his humanity, which means I know I live in the same world as he does, albeit in a different context. That conscience, on which you could ring a coin without question, was a gift then and remains a call now.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And if I now ask David to unmute himself, and we look forward to hearing what he has to say before we move into a time of question and answer.
Thank you for the opportunity to respond at this launch of Michael Watts's Oxford D.Phil dissertation of 1966. Members of the Baptist Historical Society will know that Clifford is a hero of mine, since I've spoken about him at least twice before. This characteristically thorough dissertation by Michael Watts adds considerably to the existing literature on Clifford because of his meticulous research, particularly in the files of the General Baptist Magazine and of the Westbourne Park Record, which have made possible a more detailed account of what might be called Clifford's occasional writings as editor of each. I've chosen to focus on the very last part of the dissertation. It necessarily goes as far as Clifford's death in 1923, thereby beyond 1906, the terminal date of the Dissenters Volume 3, published in 2015, itself a posthumous publication following Michael's death in 2011. It enables us to see possible shifts in his explanations for the decline of nonconformity after 1906. First, though, we must note the significance of Michael's use of statistics, which is clear in the dissertation. This reflected a more general increase in the use of statistics by historians. In the earlier volumes of the Dissenters, he used membership and attendance figures to substantiate a hitherto more impressionistic sense of nonconformist growth. Even earlier, the dissertation shows him using the concept of swing in election results developed by political historians in successive post-World War II general election studies to provide a more sophisticated analysis of the relative importance of issues, regional political geography, and social and occupational structure in the shaping of election results. In the dissertation, he used an analysis of by-election results after the introduction of Balfour's Education Bill in 1901 to demonstrate the harm done by the issue of education to the Conservatives, challenging the view held by Halevi in the last part of his History of the English People, published in 1932, but in French much earlier, challenging Halevi's view that education did not play a significant part in the election results of 1905-6. Michael showed that education was the primary political issue between 1902 and 1905, with swings of 10+% in 7 elections and more than 15% to the Liberals 3 and Labour 1. Though it has to be said that the Conservatives did hold 3 seats against swings of over 15%. That particular point is not explored. The favoured alternative explanation for the 1906 defeat was the unpopularity of Chamberlain's tariff reform or imperial preference proposal made in 1903 as a diversionary tactic, because Chamberlain, as a non-conformist liberal unionist, was keenly aware of the danger to the Conservatives of a non-conformist unity in opposition to them based on education. Michael showed that tariff reform did not make very much difference to Conservative performance. And Clifford was important in this because he had been one of the nonconformists who raised the dangers to board schools of Balfour's thinking on education as early as 1901, before the bill was introduced into Parliament. Those by-election figures were summarised in Volume 3 of the Dissenters, but are given in much more detail in the dissertation. How, if at all, did Michael's explanations for the decline of nonconformity shift? In relation to Clifford in particular, Michael criticised him for moving too far away from a traditional atonement-based theology towards a humanism more akin to the theology of F.D. Maurice and other Anglican thinkers. But he generally, Michael, that is, supported Clifford against Spurgeon in his analysis of the downgrade controversy at the end of the 1880s, just when Clifford, who was a personal friend of Spurgeon, was on the verge of becoming president of the Baptist Union. But the credibility of the belief in the inevitability of human progress, derived by Clifford from Emerson, was severely damaged by the tragedy of the First World War. Worse than that, it destroyed the assumed moral superiority of the UK and imperial foreign policy that had been such an important part of Clifford's partial support for imperialism. For Michael, it was significant that Clifford was still looking for a social explanation of human problems. On the other hand, he still used the language of sin. In Michael's view, that exposed the shallowness of Clifford's theology. And it is true that Clifford's talents were more philosophical than theological. But Clifford was right to see the significance of biblical interpretation. And I would say he was also right to see that simply to repeat the more traditional view that social reforms like better housing and the reduction of poverty could only be achieved by personal salvation. These are areas where, as we still see today, some catchy rhetoric often makes more impact than carefully argued statistics. Clifford's great gifts were as an orator, both as a preacher and a campaigner. What Michael did bring out in a way which Sir James Marchant did not in his earlier biography of Clifford was the significance which the campaign for personal evangelism assumed for Clifford in the last years of his life. It was in the Baptist Union Council debate on the appointment of a commissioner for evangelism that he died on the 20th of November 1923. As far as the decline of nonconformity in the 20th century is concerned, I have argued elsewhere that I think we still need to look at demographic explanations linked to the religious sociology of the family rather than the First World War. The roots of nonconformist decline can be traced back at least as far as the 1880s, and this may be seen from some of the tables in Michael's The Dissenters, Volume 2, particularly his early insight into the significance of nonconformist membership as a percentage of population with its regional variations. Notwithstanding the persistent emphasis on neglected evangelical flourishing by some historians, I failed to see sufficient evidence for it as compared with other possibilities. The best statistician in Cambridge Population and Social Structure, who sadly died young more than a decade ago, produced an entirely convincing argument based on the evidence that nonconformity was strongest where the general population was largest. And to this, I would add the question of whether religious parents produced religious children. I had long noted the number of ministers' children who never joined the church of whatever denomination. Here it is interesting that Clifford's 3 sons, who were dutiful in their youth, never succeeded to any position in the church, whereas his eldest daughter, Kate, acted as her father's secretary during Clifford's later years, particularly as his sight began to fail. Gradually at first and more rapidly after 1945, Sunday schools were declining as a recruiting ground for church membership, and I've witnessed that in my lifetime. The one critical comment I would make about the book is that there is no index.
Well, thank you, David, and let me also add my thanks to Ruth for your sets of comments. In a modern era where arguably too many students perhaps rush to publish PhD theses, it has clearly took a very long time for this thesis to see the to come to fruition. But when it has done, obviously it has come into a changed and developed milieu. And to hear both your takes on its appraisal and the in the light of what has occurred over the last years, as well as its comments on the world as it could observe them, has been really interesting.